I'm Scott Hodge, president of the Tax Foundation. I'm really delighted to have with me to interview Bob Shapiro, a longtime friend of mine and the Tax Foundation. Bob was both founder, I would guess, and longtime head of PricewaterhouseCoopers Washington office. But before that, he was the chief of staff at the Joint Committee on Taxation. And that's the focus of today's interview, and to get a sense of your experiences on Capitol Hill, and be able to share those with others who are maybe new to Capitol Hill. And so I guess the question that I get a lot, and I've as long as I've known you, I've never known how you got into tax in the first place, and how did you end up on Capitol Hill?
Thank you, Scott. First of all, let me say that I have a great deal of affection for the Tax Foundation. First of all, the person who was chief of staff before me started his whole career at the Tax Foundation, Larry Woodworth, and I'll probably blend that in one of your questions later.
Yeah.
So Larry was very dedicated, loyal to the Tax Foundation, and I felt the same affection for it. I've known you for a long time. I think you and the Tax Foundation do some very good work, particularly focusing on some state issues that don't get as much attention, but you also get involved in the federal area too. And I think that you've got a lot of corporate sponsors that have a great deal of respect for you personally and for the Tax Foundation's work. And it's a voice that I think is very important and does a lot of good work. So for that background, let me respond to your question. First of all, I have a business background and a business interest. And as I looked around, I looked at companies and people, high officials, CEOs, and others in those companies, and noticed a blend of them having a background in legal background in many cases, and or financial, tax, accounting. As a result of that, I thought those would be the two backgrounds for me to pursue to prepare myself to go into a business environment. I got a CPA. I did that first, and then I went to law school to get a legal background. And then I thought I should get a tax background. So after my second year in law school, I worked for the IRS as an intern and got experience there as, from law school. And then in my third year, I thought I should get some Capitol Hill experience, having had IRS. So someone told me to go to the Joint Committee on Taxation. I didn't know anything about it. I applied to work for nothing, just to get on there, get some experience in my third year in law school. They hired me to come in. They actually gave me a salary, and interesting in those days, they put me at $45 for 15 hours, which is $3 an hour. I loved it so much. I was there over 40 hours a week, and an equivalent to about $1 an hour, but I didn't care. I just loved it. Afterwards, I loved the congressional staff and Joint Committee so much that I never interviewed with a law firm or a corporation, and I was leaning towards the corporate side, and I didn't have an offer. The Joint Committee had never hired somebody from law school, but having been there as an intern, they came to me in late spring, and they asked me if I would like to stay, and since I would have loved to have done it, I jumped at it. So that's how I got there, in a backward kind of way, but I was there for 15 years, and I absolutely loved it.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I mean, I'm sure that during that time that you had some mentors or other staffers that you looked up to that kind of showed you the ropes or took you under their wing and gave you guidance on your career.
I did. The one person I referred to earlier is Larry Woodworth, who was his chief of staff of the Joint Committee. The Joint Committee, frankly, was created in 1927. It only had 3 chiefs of staff. Larry had been chief of staff since the early 1960s. He'd been on the staff for 32 years. He actually went to the Treasury. President Carter appointed him as Assistant Secretary of Treasury. I was the deputy chief of staff, and I was actually considering leaving the Joint Committee, but when Larry was being considered, I would stay, allow him to go there because he wanted me to take over the staff. But Larry Woodworth was kind of a symbol of a fatherly type figure in the Joint Committee staff. I had enormous respect to him, as did the entire tax policy community, law firms, accounting firms, people in business. And he was kind of an idol of mine. So I followed his footsteps. We stayed very close, unfortunately, until his untimely death after 1 year at the Treasury Department. But Larry Woodworth was the key person that I tried to model my career and focus on the Joint Committee after.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned him because Tom Bartold sent me a copy of Larry Woodward's obituary. And in it, it mentions the fact that he started his career at the Tax Foundation back when our headquarters were in New York City. So I just love that connection. I think it's a fantastic one. Well, do you remember a moment, during that time when you kind of thought, well, I just witnessed history. This will be part of my memoirs.
An interesting thing, Scott, there is an incident that I recall and refer to from time to time that was a funny situation. I don't know if it's history, but it had something to do that I was involved in, that the story is an interesting one. In the windfall profit tax in 1980, we had a House bill and a Senate bill. The administration had proposed a proposal, windfall profit tax. The House made its changes, the Senate made its changes, we went into conference. Jim Schlesinger was the Secretary of Energy, and a lot of it was energy policy. And we finished the package, putting together a conference agreement, and we had everything signed and sealed and signed off. And about 2 to 3 hours after that, I get a call from Jim Schlesinger, who said that, and he was representing the administration. He said, I just got back, and one of the major provisions in there, I didn't quite understand exactly what they did, because when I read about it, as to it was different than what I thought, and people down here in the department told me about it. We need to change that because it doesn't work right, and we just have to change that agreement. So I said, Jim, we had already signed off. We agreed to the conference. We announced it. This wasn't a provision that you fall on your sword for, but it was something. It was after the fact, and we've never made a major change like that. So I called the both chairmen, and both chairmen said, sure, we need to make it. So we divided up as Jim Schlesinger took half the members of the conference committee. I took the other half on the people he knew the best, and I called the others, and we told them we had to make this change. We got the agreement. So everybody came back positive. So we made a change to the conference agreement after it was done to modify it in a way that would work effectively the way it was intended. So I thought that was a very interesting incident. It caused no problem, but it was a change in history that I found very interesting.
Well, and the fact that you got everybody to agree, you don't see that sort of comedy very often, I would think. Um, when you did become staff director and taking over for Woodward, knowing the sort of, I don't know, iconic history of the Joint Committee and what it stood for, was it at all intimidating? How did that history or legacy impact you?
Absolutely, it was intimidating. First of all, I was young at the time. I was 35 years old. Larry Woodworth was somewhat of a major player in the entire tax policy world in the Capitol Hill. He was respected by Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, and all phases, whether it was liberals, moderate, conservatives, had tremendous respect for him. Whether they agreed or not agree with some of his policy perspective, they respected him. And the administration, both Democrat and Republican, I was there under both, had tremendous respect for him. And he had been there 32 years. And here I was, even though I was the deputy, stepping into his shoes to take over was quite a feat. I was very unnerved by that. And I will tell you for a fact that had I not been on the staff at the time, I would have never been considered because of my age, but they had seen me for a number of years. So that they all knew me. My age was not relevant. They understood I worked. I was a disciple of Larry Woodworth. So it really was a major factor. But I tried to follow it the way he did, deal with all the members, both the more senior ones, the more junior ones, checking with them regularly, and try to go right down the middle and not put my personal hat on, but to put the tax policy hat on. So I followed the mold that Larry set. And although it was very intimidating at the beginning, I think having been there before and watched him made it very easier, not easy, but easier and convenient to follow up.
I'm sure that if you were to ask anybody on the street about the Joint Committee on Taxation, they probably never heard of it. But I think most people on Capitol Hill understand its importance. What would the process look like without the Joint Committee on Taxation, and why is it so important to the process?
It's very interesting. In my day, in the prior years, the Joint Committee staff was the key tax policy staff in Washington in the Congress, both sides, House, Senate, Democrat, and Republican. In fact, neither the Ways and Means nor the Finance Committee had significant tax policy background. They had people that served the committee by responding to letters. They came to the meetings, but the Joint Committee staff historically at that time did all the tax policy on a nonpartisan basis. I should say, as most people probably know, the Joint Committee is a nonpartisan staff. And the chairman of the Joint Committee itself alternates between the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and the chairman of the Finance Committee. So it had a very important, unique function. It went to both caucuses, if there were caucuses, and tried to find a way to bring people together. In my day, you tended to try to find a middle and tweak it a little bit and work it out. So that went very well. Today, it's changed a lot. You don't have as big a middle, and it's gotten a little more, I say maybe a lot more partisan. I'm not trying to be critical. Times change, things are different, and you have to deal with the way it works today. So you have to adapt and adjust. In my day, it was probably easier for a chief of staff because the job of the Joint Committee staff is to find the middle and bring them together. I will tell you, there's another very important function of the Joint Committee, which is revenue estimating. And in every bill, you have a Treasury estimate, and they follow the Joint Committee estimate. The staff coordinates with the Treasury, but the Joint Committee, the final estimate. So a very critical role of the Joint Committee is to do a revenue estimate. And remember, it is an estimate, the best you can get. And many provisions are accepted or declined based on the revenue estimate on how much it adds or takes away from the public treasury. So that is a continuing role that is a very important one. And the tax policy role is still very important. Tom Barthel, the President Chief of Staff, is highly respected in the committees. However, they ask him the tax policy question, he'll give them his answer. The staff does the research, but to the extent they make decisions, and if it's a partisan position, then the partisan staffs will take more of an active role in that regard. So it's changed. Once again, I want to be very clear. I'm not going to say it's worse. It's different.
Yeah, but thinking back to the role that you and your colleagues played and the expertise that you brought to the process, can you remember a time where you were able to help improve some legislation or perhaps even prevent some unintended consequences?
Yes, there were times. Let me try to describe the process in my day. Is that the administration make a proposal? The Congress, whether it's Democrat or Republican administration, I was there during both. The Ways and Means and Finance Committee believed they were independent and that they would review the policy. It came from the Treasury. It was reviewed by the White House, but Treasury led it. Treasury was at the table. We had hearings, we had markup sessions, and then after the hearings, the Joint Committee staff would sit at the table along with Treasury, and they would ask for our positions. In fact, I was always asked to bring alternatives to the committee. When I say I mean all the chiefs of staff, so it's not just me. Alternatives. And sometimes I'd know where the committee was. I'd make recommendations based on that. So I think the Joint Committee staff in liaison with the Treasury would make recommendations and had a very important role in the process. And the revenue estimates were very important to try to have revenue neutral if a bill was that way, or to try to balance things out. And to the extent that they reduce revenue, and the idea was to balance that, to find ways to make it. That was something that I think was very important in that respect. So we did do that. So at any rate, I think the Joint Committee staff does play an important role. It's a different role today, but I think it's an important one. I will tell you one thing that's an interesting history that's changed, and the change is very interesting. In 1981, you had an indexing, the tax system. When you had indexing, that means as inflation went up, the tax code is indexed for inflation. Prior to that time, we had a tax bill almost every year, at least every other year, while I was there. And what you did was we took a large number of people off the tax rolls every year, and the Congress took credit. We took millions of people off the tax rolls. Frankly, it was the same people. What happened is they'd go up, and because of inflation, they'd start paying tax again, but they were still below the poverty level, but they're at the level where they pay taxes. So we took the same people off the tax rolls because, in effect, we did indexing every year. And the Congress got credited for taking the people off the tax roll. And I remember making the comment to them, indexing is the right tax policy thing, but it's going to hurt you because you got credit for taking all these people off the tax rolls. And we use that money to make changes and other things. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. And it was the right tax policy. But in the 1980s, you found that they had to make everything revenue neutral because they didn't have tax inflation to use to take people off the tax rolls, get credit for it, or to make some technical changes that they thought were appropriate.
That's really interesting. Boy, the days of inflation and stagflation and so forth. And can you remember what's the most memorable piece of legislation you may have worked at that time?
Well, the ones that I recall, Scott, that were very meaningful to me was tax reform and tax simplification,
Mhm.
trying to make the code better overall. The tax code had a lot of provisions that were designed for certain unique situations, and it wasn't good tax policy in some cases. And tax reform tried to even it out. And my job was to try to present to the committee ways to have tax reform that made a system work better from a tax policy point. They didn't accept it all, of course. Remember, the purpose of the tax system is to raise revenue for the government. However, over the years, the tax system is used for many purposes, for economic, social purposes, energy, ways to deal like investment tax credit is used for economic purposes when they need to stimulate the economy. So there are a lot of reasons the tax code was used for various purposes. That doesn't mean all those were the good tax policy, but they were meaningful results. And my job during tax reform and my predecessors were to bring to the attention of Congress things that may have been outdated, no longer needed for today and in my day, but were appropriate then. So the extent that we did tax reform and reviewed all these provisions that may have had some meaning then, but may not be good tax policy during the tax reform were brought to the attention of the committee. They had to make the policy decision as to whether they wanted to make the changes or to keep some of them in. So my job was to put them all on the table, and they made that policy perspective. Tax simplification are there ways that we can make the system better and easier? And the best way that we did it that I tried to focus on was the tax form. Most of the people, the only experience they had with the tax system other than the larger corporations was the tax form that they filled out. To the extent we could make the tax form simpler and easier to fill out, that was tax simplification. And some of the rules were reviewed in order to do that. So I felt that was a meaningful role of the Joint Committee staff and myself on a nonpartisan basis to try to provide a simpler and fairer tax system.
What's the most memorable or interesting thing you ever saw during a hearing or on the floor, and you kind of remarked, "Well, I can't believe I just saw that"?
Well, I'm going to give you several examples of went over
I
that
think
I think
your
were
paper is on the screen, Bob.
okay. I'm sorry. Thank you.
That's all right.
Several examples that I have. The first one was a tax reform example, and that is we finished the House bill and the Senate bill, and we're in conference on tax reform. And a congressman, Ways and Means, who they already finished their bill, has said he said, "I've got a tax reform proposal that I insist that I want in there." He said, "I want to disallow country club dues." And I commented, the chairman looked at me and I said, it's not in conference, it's not in either bill. And the rules of conference is you've got to go between the two bills. You can't bring anything new. For example, if something was 5X and something else is 15X, you go in between 10X or anything in between 5 and 15, but you can't bring in 20 or 2 because that's not in the scope of conference. So country clubs and the country club dues disallowance was not in conference. And I mentioned that. He said, "It doesn't matter." He said, "This is tax reform." And I've seen a lot of people in my district, they take their business people, they go to country club, they deduct their dues. And I just think that's not right. And I commented that that's an enforcement. Right now, you're not allowed to do that if the IRS can enforce it administratively and disallow it. He said, "But they don't. And I want to make it clear." So I said, you're going to hear about it because it's not in tax reform. And he came in so strong that the committee agreed to do that. They just rolled me on it. And they adopted that you're not allowed to do country club dues and at all. Well, 3 hours after that was done, I got a call from the chairman and said, "You know that provision on country clubs? We got to take it out." I said, "Well, I thought that you heard about it." He said, "Yes, we did, from the all types of people that are affected by that. And I've talked to the other chairman and members. We have to take that out." I said, "Well, what excuse do I use when I tell them we're taking it out?" He said, "The staff misunderstood us. That of course it wasn't in conference." So I had to take all the blame for something that I misunderstood, that you weren't allowed to do that in conference. So that was one example. The second example that I had was a windfall profit tax, where they wanted to spend money. They wanted to put a windfall profit tax in, and they wanted to spend money to put it back in to help people as they pay for higher energy costs and other things. And I had to give an estimate, a 10-year estimate from the Joint Committee on what revenue would be raised, because they want to spend 10 years worth of revenue. And I gave them a revenue estimate plus or minus $100 billion. And they said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I have no idea how much oil we'll discover tomorrow or 5 years out." And I said, "Plus or minus 100 billion, that depends on how much oil we find." And guess what? I was wrong. they didn't produce anywhere near plus or minus $100 billion. Ultimately, it was repealed, but because we were just guessing, we told them that. The third one is a very interesting one. This is the last one I have. It was a gas guzzler tax. The administration proposed a gas guzzler tax, which means that a larger car or that used more gas, that they had to pay a tax on it to encourage the industry to produce cars that produce lesser fuel efficient cars in that regard. So I was instructed by the chairman, and they had a hearing. And in the hearing, the administration wanted a very strong tax. The oil industry, the auto industry didn't want any tax, and just a token, if at all, but no tax. That's what they argued for. We went to the markup session, and the chairman, after hearing from everybody, on behalf of the staff, instructed me to meet with the administration, meet with the auto industry, meet with the energy industry, and bring back a compromise that the committee could enact that would meet the objectives of everybody. So I and the staff met with the administration, met the auto industry, the energy industry, and first of all, we designed several alternatives. We presented to them. Neither the administration nor the auto or energy industry, the oil and gas industry, liked it. They opposed everything we did, both sides. I went to the chairman and I presented. I said, Mr. Chairman, this is a committee session. I said, this is a proposal that the staff believes is a fair compromise, but we failed. Unfortunately, neither the administration nor the auto or energy industry liked it. So I didn't bring back one they liked. One of the members said, that must be the right one. If nobody liked it, that means it's the right one. And they adopted exactly what the staff brought because none of them agreed to it.
Well, when you think of all the interactions that you had with members, what was the most difficult interaction or incident, I guess, that you may have had with a member of Congress?
Okay, Scott, thank you. That's tough because overall, being a nonpartisan staff, my relationship with the members overall was good. They didn't always agree with some of the staff's tax policy viewpoints because they heard from some of their constituents of firms and how they were being lobbied. But I would say a couple come to mind. There are probably a whole bushel of them, but one of them came to mind were in a hearing in one of the tax writing committees, a senator is in the finance committee, brought a proposal up that he had not discussed with me ahead of time. Usually he did so the staff can help prepare him, but he brought a proposal up that I had not spent a lot of time on, but it was on the list of something that may come up. And it was a proposal that was really very poor tax policy. And he brought it up, made his case for it. The senator, the chairman asked me for my tax policy perspective. And I said, Mr. Chairman, I haven't had a chance to overly study it, but it's on the list. So I did review it with the staff. And it really does not meet the tax policy objectives for these various points. Now, I listed the reasons why it had tax policy objections. And based on the analysis staff gave, and Treasury did not support it either. The committee voted it down. In fact, there's not even any votes for it. They just voted it down. The senator called me in his office later in the day, and he kind of reamed me out, just screamed and yelled at me that my job was, when he brought up a proposal, my job was to support it and give the arguments for it to help it pass. And I said, well, the chairman asked my view, and I gave the tax policy view. He said, your job is to find the ways to get it done. He was screaming at me and mad. I was really unnerved. I went to the chairman afterwards and I said, Mr. Chairman, I just had a very unpleasant experience. And I explained it. And the chairman said, you did the right thing. So he said, he gave me cover and said, don't worry about it. Made me feel better, but I was really unnerved. The second one is a little funny one that happened to me in a lot of cases, but because it was with the chairman, I can use that as the illustration. Many of the members of Congress, particularly the chairman, when they had very difficult constituent issues or corporate issues in their district, it was tough for them to say no, representing their district. And the chairman called me into one that was a very tough oil and gas issue. And Chairman Long, Russell Long, was an oil producer, state Louisiana, and he wanted me to sit with them, and I listened to it. And what he did was what he did all the time. He's shaking his head, yep, 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 yep. And after he's doing it, they thanked him, and he thanked me, said, we'll look into it. And we went outside, and the about 5 to 10 the constituents there in this proposal, and they asked me to draft and prepare all the materials to be introduced. And I said, well, we're not ready for that yet. So, yes, the chairman agreed to it. He was just nodding his head and saying, yep, 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 and agreeing to it. And so he's ready. So I hope you're not blocking it. He said, the chairman's there, and we want you to do that. And so the chairman can introduce it. I went back to my office. I called the chairman's office. I said, I need to speak to the chairman. Can I meet with him later today? And they worked me in. I walked in the office and said, Mr. Chairman, you got me into a lot of trouble. And he said, how's that? And I said, you remember that meeting we had this morning? I said, you're nodding your head. And I know what that meant. Yep, yep, yep means you're listening. They thought you're agreeing with them. And they, at the meeting, they got mad at me. And he just nodded and smiled. He knew exactly what he was doing. I'm the one that was the fall guy for that. So that's what happens to a staff person on Capitol Hill from time to time, but it goes to the territory. I understood it. It unnerved me from time to time, but that goes to the territory.
Well, I guess that leads to the final question is, what's the most important thing that you learned working on the Hill? And then what advice would you give to a young staffer today?
Well, thank you, Scott. Let me add one experience I had when I left the staff that meant a lot to me that I can bring into this and tie into it. I'd left the staff after 15 years. Bob Dole became a new chairman of the Finance Committee, and he was making a major speech. He was asked to do at the Chamber of Commerce at a luncheon speech. A large number of people there. He was the new chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. Republicans took control of the Senate, and he acknowledged I was there. I was sitting up front. He acknowledged I was in the group, and he started talking. And all of a sudden, he looked at me and he told the audience. He said, I've worked with Bob for many years. I haven't the slightest idea what party he's in. And that meant to me was, first of all, I'd never registered in a party because I felt the Joint Committee staff being nonpartisan, I was neither Democrat or Republican. I still have never registered in a party. I've been asked to go back in the government on several occasions by both Democrat and Republican side, and I didn't know if I wanted to go back in, but I've never registered. But that was a compliment to me that I called it right down the middle, didn't bend whether it's Democrat or Republican, and I had no partisan affiliation in that regard. I would say for a new staffer today that times are different. In my day, being a nonpartisan staff and a committee staff who wanted to be in the middle was one thing. Today, it's a little more difficult, a little more partisan than what we've seen, and the staff should try to be as balanced as they can, recognizing that what is good tax policy, if you're in the tax policy world, you recognize who staff you're working for and where your allegiances are, but try to understand the other side. So when you present your side, you know where the issues are. And I found my congressional experience, my 15 years, invaluable. I absolutely loved it. I would have liked to have gone back in, and stayed longer, but with the family, it was so demanding. I was there 6 days a week. I didn't get home till 8, 9, or 10 many nights. Missed a lot of things with the family. And Congress became year-round. The early days, it wasn't. They adjourned in August. They didn't work as late. They didn't require it. It wasn't they didn't work. The system didn't require it. Later, it did. And it's much more difficult to spend a career there as a staffer, although many people do, and I applaud them. But it is more difficult for congressional staff, particularly Joint Committee, when you're in the House and the Senate. But bottom line, I would say you enjoy your experience, get the benefit of it, try to be balanced, see all the sides, but remember who you work for. That's where your allegiance is, but try to understand. And I felt my job was to present all the issues to the members. They make the decision, but my job is to present all the alternative type issues for their decision making. And remember what city, state they're from, and who their constituency is. So bottom line, I think that's the important thing. And I hope every new and young staffer enjoys it as much as I did and benefits and values from it. I thought it was great. And let me conclude, Scott, by saying I think groups like yours, the Tax Foundation, was invaluable to people like me to get your perspective and to hear it. Whether I agreed or not wasn't the purpose. It was to hear the perspective and understand it. And I think you and your team there made a tremendous contribution, which I appreciated and respected.
Well, thank you very much. This has been delightful. I can't thank you enough for spending time and sharing not only those experiences, but those, I think, very thoughtful advice for new members or new staffers today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah.